again for joining us for another episode of our Solidarity series, Conversations During Lockdown and Beyond. And today's webinar title is COVID-19 and Indian Economy. So the constantly evolving coronavirus has tossed a big gloom on the global economy, and this has shaken global trade, resulting in massive supply side chain reactions, disturbing a whole range of industries and services. And the lockdown especially has amplified this, resulting in a very uncertain panic, which has emptied our cities, offices, industries, markets, and roads. And we as a country are still grappling with the heartbreaking scenes of migrants trying to reach home by foot, while many are still stranded and managing to stay afloat. So with the movement of people and goods that has come to a standing, grinding halt, with everything paralyzed, fears are escalating every day for those of us who don't have options of working from home, who don't have cash in hand to buy the next meal, forget medicine and mobility. So amidst this, there's also the shortage of PPE, ventilators, cost of COVID testing, lack of hospital beds, ICUs, and hospital care itself, which has become a big concern for everybody. And with the news reports right now, with COVID-19 having reached rural India, there are very distressing thoughts that are plaguing all of us. So where was the country when this COVID hit us in the context of the economic landscape? And will COVID change the way our government decides its priorities from now on? How will it impact food security? Will the formal sector change gears and help rebuild the economy? Can the informal sector restart their businesses anytime soon? And what about the jobs? Will the jobs remain? So with the lockdown, will we change our consumption and saving behavior? So these and more questions which have been troubling all of us is best answered by our speaker for today, Professor Jayati Ghosh. Thank you, Professor Ghosh, for your time you've given for this webinar today. So to introduce Jayati Ghosh, I don't think she needs an introduction, but a quick one. So Professor Ghosh is the chairperson, Center for Economic Studies and Planning, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University. She's one of the world's leading feminist economists and has consulted for various UN organizations, including the ILO, UNDP, UNCTAD, and multinational financial institutions like ADB. She has authored around 11 books and more than 150 articles in various academic journals and a regular columnist for several Indian journals and newspapers. Professor Ghosh is closely involved with a range of progressive organizations and social movements. She is a recipient of various awards, including the UNDP Award for Excellence in Analysis and International Labour Organization's 2010 Decent Work Research Prize. So before I hand over to Professor Ghosh, just a brief about the format. The webinar is for an hour. Professor Ghosh will speak for about 20 minutes and it will be open for Q&A. If you want to ask a question, I would request you to type in your question in the chat box to save time, and keep your question brief and to the point. And please mute your microphone and keep your cell phones on silent mode. Thank you very much. Over to Professor Ghosh.
Thank you very much, Bhargavi. Just a quick clarification. I'm not actually the chairperson of my department anymore. I was 7 or 8 years ago, but obviously it's somewhere still floating on the net. So, okay, just a small clarification there. Yeah, so, you know, everybody is obviously worried about what's going to happen and what is already happening with respect to COVID. It is one of those things which worry is inevitable, because this is really, there are so many unknowns, okay, or what people would call the known unknowns. We do not know how long it will last. We do not know how much it will spread. We do not know how severe it will be, whether our systems, our health systems will be able to cope or not. We do not know globally how long it's going to last. We don't, any of these things. So there's a massive amount of uncertainty already, okay? But what is true is that already we are experiencing the most unprecedented collapse of economic activity for the past century or more. Okay, so in fact, I cannot reiterate this enough. This is unprecedented. not just for the Indian economy, for the global economy. This has never happened before the way it's happening now. And that's important because it means none of the kinds of yardsticks that people use are really applicable. People are comparing this to demonetization. That was like a walk in the park compared to what is going to happen now. People are comparing this to the global financial crisis. Again, that was really quite minor for the Indian economy. I cannot think of a comparable event, not the Great Depression, not the World Wars, because this is a simultaneous collapse of demand and supply. We are seeing this now. We're in the middle of the third week, or just beginning the third week of this lockdown. All the indications are that something like this lockdown will continue for many states for quite a while, even if there's a partial lifting. But already there is massive economic damage created by this lockdown, and I will talk about what exactly that kind of damage is. And that damage doesn't get resolved easily. You have to actually have very strong proactive measures to fix it. Okay, you can't simply say, well, all right, now the lockdown's over, now we just start again where we left off. Because many, many things have been destroyed. Production capacity has been destroyed. Supply chains have been broken. People's incomes have collapsed. They will not have money to spend, even if you can imagine economic activity beginning. Many of the jobs that are lost will not come back. So it's really, I'm sorry to sound so depressing, but unfortunately we have to recognize the magnitude of this problem if we're actually going to put in place policies to fix it. So just to give you a sense, this is genuinely unprecedented. We have experienced nothing like this before, and it therefore requires unprecedented policy response. Okay, before I get into the various economic implications, one point, why did we do this? Why have we in India imposed the most draconian lockdown in the world? By the way, this is actually globally, ours is the most severe. Ours is the one that has really seen this from the beginning as a law and order problem rather than a public health problem. We have treated anybody who breaks this as a criminal rather than as somebody who perhaps for desperation needs to be out on the street or on their way somewhere or whatever. So this is, the Indian lockdown is actually much, much more severe and worse than any other lockdown. By the way, is there a flickering that all of you are getting, or is that just me? Okay, it's just me. So I'm carrying on. Right. So that in turn means that the economic impact has been much, much worse for us than, again, most other countries. Now, it's particularly bad because this is happening to an economy that was already in a downslide. Some people believed that the Indian economy was already in recession last quarter, and that the data were being fudged to cover it up. So we were already either stagnating or in decline. Already we had very high rates of unemployment. Already agriculture was facing severe difficulty. Informal economy was in many, many closures and so on. Now, into that economy, we are imposing a complete break of most economic activity. So production, distribution, demand, everything collapses, right? So you cannot begin to imagine what that means. That means that it's a massive, massive impact, especially on the poor. Of course, people are aware of that. The plight of migrants who are desperate to go back and the treatment that they've been given, that everybody knows now what's going on in terms of that. But what is important to notice that this is not a lockdown in specific sectors. It's generalized. It's not confined to, let's say, travel, tourism, hospitality, the kinds of things people thought originally when there was restrictions on mobility. It is across all activities. Even the most basic subsistence activities like agriculture are affected because farmers are not able to get their produce to market, because the distribution channels have been destroyed. The mandis have been destroyed. In fact, it's not even clear how procurement operations will take place. None of this has been worked out. If it's so severe, why did we impose such a terrible draconian lockdown? I would argue it was not necessary to do it in such a terrible way, and it was certainly not necessary to do it without any prior warning, without any planning, without consulting the state governments, without even consulting other cabinet ministers in your own government. But because it was done in this terrible way, the impact has been even worse. As you know, 90% of our workers are informal. That means no job security and no social protection of any meaningful kind. So not only have most of them lost their jobs or certainly their incomes over this period, but there's nothing to protect them otherwise, which speaks to a sort of economic devastation that we cannot really begin to imagine. Okay, so it's very, very severe. And it's an impact from the demand side, which is obvious. People lose their jobs, people lose their wages, so they cannot buy and so on. But importantly, it's also a shock from the supply side. So that's the funny thing. You see, the big depressions and crises that we are familiar with are demand side crises. Periods of war are typically supply side crises, you know, when you cannot produce because some supply chains are broken or because you're directing all your resources to the war effort or whatever. But even that is not comparable, because even during a war, you can still move people around. You can still actually mobilize people to produce in a certain way and to ramp up certain kinds of production and so on. Here, you're not doing either. Now, that's extraordinary. And that means that it's not just a question of will it affect this sector, that sector, will it affect small and medium enterprises or micro enterprises, will it affect agriculture? It will affect everyone, from the biggest capitalists to the tiny micro entrepreneur, the self-employed person selling bananas on a cart. Everybody is affected. What I am particularly concerned about right now is, in fact, not just the demand side, but really the supply side. The government announced that it was going to ensure the supply of necessities, but that's actually much more complicated than it sounds. All they did was to exempt certain commodities from the list of things which you cannot transport. Now, that's not good enough, because first of all, there's no clear definition of necessities. They said food and medicines, but in fact, you know, it's a broader definition. Which kinds of food, which kinds of medicine, and what about other things like toiletries or basic goods that you need in the hospital, in the homes, or cleaning agents, and so on and so forth. So it's not a clear definition. More importantly, the government doesn't seem to remember that it's not just enough to distribute them, you have to produce them. We are already experiencing shortages. And it's because production has ceased. And it's not just production of the so-called necessity, because producing that requires inputs. It requires distribution linkages. All of those have gone. So, you know, it's even a food processing factory requires certain inputs. It has to access those. That means you have to think about what are the input linkages and whether you're sustaining those. The distribution itself, packaging has been destroyed. So a lot of food that used to come in packets, that too has become a problem. So we have to think about the supply conditions. I don't see any evidence that the government is doing that, because you can't do that sitting in North Block. You know, you can't do that just centrally from above. You have to take state governments into consultation and work it out together. You have to actually do planning. This is not a government that is keen on planning. So there's no sign that they're doing the planning that is required just to ensure the supplies. So I'm really worried that supply shortages would emerge fairly soon, especially if this lockdown is continued beyond April 15th, which everyone seems to think it will more or less be continued in different ways. The purpose of the lockdown, let me go back to that, was not just to prevent the spread of the disease, containment as it's called, but it was also to prepare. In fact, the WHO made it clear over and over again, the lockdown is basically buying you time. You have to use that time to prepare. You have to ramp up your public health expenditure. You have to make sure you have the testing kits, the medical equipment, the protective equipment. You have to make sure you have enough health workers who are properly paid and properly protected. You have to make sure you have enough hospital beds and other measures for quarantining and everything. So in other words, this 3-week period was a time for the government to make sure that everything was in place. Otherwise, you're not just kicking a can down the road, because it's not a can that stays the same size. It grows and grows. And it will actually come back rolling at you, because it's uphill that we're going, actually. So there's a real problem in terms of the inadequate measures that have been taken, even on the public health side, which means that, first of all, you can't lift the lockdown completely. But secondly, even if you do, the public health problems will persist and seep into the economy. If more people keep getting sick, you cannot try and recover the economy as you could in the past. The traditional monetary and fiscal policies, again, cannot be used. Now, I think that's very important. You can't simply say, well, we know we'll reduce interest rates, we'll increase liquidity in the system, and that, oh, we'll have a little bit more public expenditure. That's not good enough. We need to ensure supplies of the things of items of mass consumption, which means looking at the input-output relationships, which means planning. And we need to actually make sure people have got what they need to survive, which means handing over cash at this point to people. I'm not a big fan of cash transfers myself, okay? I basically believe in employment programs as the more equitable and dignified way of doing this. But right now, there's no option. You cannot do employment programs. You have to do cash transfers. So you have to do massive, massive cash transfers. Just to give you an idea, globally, most governments have put fiscal stimulus of between 5 to 15% of GDP. In Europe, it's up to 15% in some cases. In the United States, it's 10%. This is just the increase in spending, not the public health part. The public health part is separate. This is just the increase in government spending to keep the economy afloat. What has our government done so far? A tiny little response, which is 0.5% of GDP in new spending. That's obviously not just not enough, it will do nothing to prevent this economy from absolutely falling off a cliff. So we need a massive, massive increase in public expenditure, which is on one side, obviously, a big increase in public health spending. On another side, a very large increase in money handed over to people. And there are different ways in which you could do this. You could use every household which is on the National Food Security Act, everyone who gets rations, basically, 70% effectively of the households. You could use the MNREGA workers list because they are unable to work. Instead of promising a 20 rupee hike in the wages, which anyway was due because it works with the consumer price index, actually provide incomes directly into their bank accounts, because at the moment you cannot provide them work. So you have to actually do something like that. Use the pensions, the list of people who have pensions. In other words, there are ways in which you could distribute this money. So you basically just put money in their hands, but then you have to make sure there's enough supply to meet what they will demand. So you must work on the supply of necessities. You have to actually make sure that food, basic items of agriculture, the crops, the distribution of those, all of these basic necessities, including other necessities that people forget about. They don't seem to think that it's only food and medicine. You can't just live on that. You need a range of other provisions. All of those continue to be produced and adequately distributed. There's nothing like that which is clearly organized at the moment. We don't even have a central nodal authority that is going to do all this. We have a group of ministers, which God knows what they're doing, and we have a few phone calls of the Prime Minister to chief ministers. Not good enough. We need much more coordinated planning to ensure these supplies. Otherwise, you're going to get these sectoral shortages. And I fear that we would even possibly get, in the extreme case, not just starvation and hunger, which is already happening, but even food riots. Because if you do not address the supply side along with the demand side, there's going to be massive problems. I haven't even talked about the impact from the external economy, because I thought this is depressing enough, right? I don't want to make it utterly depressing for you, but just have to tell you that what's happening from the global economy, it's all headwinds. It's only bad news, okay? Exports obviously collapsing because everybody's economy is shrinking. Imports are going to become tighter and more expensive, but worst of all, we have massive capital outflow already. Financial markets are behaving as they usually do. They fly to safety when there's a first problem, and we've had a massive capital outflow. It's going to get worse unless we bring in capital controls. So all of these domestic measures have to be accompanied by capital controls, otherwise we keep bleeding. We're going to have problems servicing our international debt. Some of our large companies are already going to have big problems servicing their dollar debts. It's not our government debt so much, that's not a big problem, but a lot of large companies, including public sector and private sector, took on a lot of dollar-denominated debt. They're all going to have problems. They're all going to come cap in hand to the government. And we know the government is much more willing to give bailouts to large corporates. So there's a real danger that a lot of money goes there rather than into just keeping this population alive, reasonably fed, in reasonable good health. What does all this mean? It means that we've had so far I would argue, the most unequal, unjust, even sadistic response to COVID-19 in the whole world. And that response has dramatically worsened our economic prospects. I do believe it could have been done differently. I believe it could have been done with more, just giving the population a chance to respond. You took 4 months to figure out that there's a problem, and you give the whole population 4 hours. So I think it could have been done differently. But I think it's also important to note that it's still not too late, that it can still, the government can take bold measures to somehow revive the situation. They have to be very bold because the situation, as I have told you, is very, very bad. So I have a bunch of questions already, and maybe I will just start answering some of these. Yes, okay. So Rajendra Ravi is saying, शहरों से गांव की ओर पुनः पलायन की तत्काल और भविष्य में क्या प्रभाव पड़ने वाला है? ऐसा है राजेंद्र जी, दो चीजें हैं. एक है कि अभी एक बहुत बड़ा, क्या कहूं मैं, ट्रस्ट ब्रेकडाउन हो चुका है, क्योंकि ये जो शहर में काम करने वाले थे, ये बहुत सारे कुछ उन्होंने सहा है. जैसे नोटबंदी में जो संकट आए, सारे कुछ उन्होंने झेल लिया है. अब क्या है कि ये घर जाने की जो मतलब अधिकार है, ये भी छीन लिया है ना. अब इतना बड़ा एक ट्रस्ट डेफिसिट हो गया है कि मुझे सचमुच में पता नहीं है कि गांवों में तो हालत खराब होगा ही, मगर शहरों में भी बहुत खराब हालत होगा. मुझे ये भी पता नहीं कि कितने लोग आने को तैयार रहेंगे, जबकि ये भी मालूम है कि एक दिन से दूसरे दिन तक नौकरी चली जाएगी, रहने का जगह चली जाएगी, और जब घर जाने की कोशिश करते हो तो पकड़ के कन्फाइनमेंट करेंगे, पिटाई करेंगे, एसिड लगाएंगे शरीर पे. तो ये जो एक बहुत बड़ा ट्रस्ट डेफिसिट हो गया, इसका एक असर होगा ही जरूर, और इसका एक आर्थिक असर होगा, मुझे लगता है. इसको अभी हम कैसे आगे होगा मैं ठीक नहीं कह सकती हूँ, मगर मैं ये तो कह सकती हूँ कि कुछ जगह में लेबर शॉर्टेजेस भी हो जाएंगे इसी वजह से. ये बात सही है कि गांवों में भी हालत बहुत खराब रहेगी अभी, फिर भी लोग शायद सोचेंगे कि कम से कम यहाँ पे मिनिमम कुछ हमें खाने पीने का मिल जाएगा, रहने का मिल जाएगा, और वहां पे पता नहीं क्या होगा. तो एक जो रूरल अर्बन माइग्रेशन जो बहुत बड़ा एक हिस्सा हुआ था हमारे, और जो हमारी ग्रोथ के लिए बहुत जरूरी थी, ये थोड़ा सा प्रॉब्लम हो ही जाएगा. मुस्कान मैनी, what would be the future impact of the current scenario? You know, it's very bad. I'm sorry to be so depressing.
I would request you to quickly translate what you just said in Hindi,
okay,
but
sure.
not in this.
All right, sure. Rajendra had asked, what is going to be the impact of all of this reverse migration of migrant workers from the urban areas to the rural areas? And I'm saying that what has happened now is not just an economic disaster for these migrants, but it's also a dramatic breakdown in trust. Because it's not just that you are at one stroke overnight telling a migrant worker, you don't have a job, you don't possibly even have a place to stay anymore because it may have been linked to your job, you don't know where your next meal is coming from, and we will prevent you from going back home. We will treat you as a criminal if you try and go back home. That's a dramatic change. That has actually led to a huge decline in trust for many of the people who have arrived back in villages, who may not be willing to actually, again, risk everything, despite whatever terrible conditions we have in the rural areas, who may not be as willing to risk everything and come and work in cities if this is the kind of terrible thing that could happen to them at any time. Muskan Maini is asking, what would be the future impact of the current scenario? Yes, Muskan, unfortunately, it's very bad news, okay? It's bad because there are such terrible multiplier effects of this. When people lose their incomes and livelihoods, they cannot actually spend for a while. Either they have taken on debt, which they cannot repay, or they are forced to take on debt now just to live. And that means in the future as well, they will be cutting down on their consumption. So the negative multiplier effects of this are going to persist. In fact, we saw this already with demonetization, and the Indian economy was still living with those negative multiplier effects of demonetization because the government didn't do enough to counteract it. So there's a real danger that we will actually get something similar now, where you will actually get continuing economic depression unless there are strong measures to counteract it. Can I expand on using the pensions? What did I mean by that? You know, there is a list of BPL pension recipients. Some state governments have increased the monthly pension, but the official government pension is still 500 rupees. Sorry, it's not even 5, it just got raised to 500. It was 200 and a few months ago it was raised to 500, which is a joke. So what I'm saying is that right now you should be putting 7,000 rupees into every bank account. Just put this money in there to keep people alive. Now, this is not even the minimum wage in most countries, in most states, but it would be enough to tide over this immediate crisis. Why do we have to think big? Because this is an economy that is collapsing. You have to revive it. How do you prevent this from becoming inflationary? By making sure you are focusing on supply. That's why I keep harping on the need to ensure supply and to plan for supply, which unfortunately this government is not doing. What do you think, Priya is asking, what do you think would be the impact of the crisis on the public sector banks? This is in context of the NPA crisis faced by banking and non-banking sectors. Yeah, not just banks, but non-banks, as you said, Priya, and not just public sector, but private sector. Every bank is going to be in a mess because no one's going to be able to repay. Now, the moratorium that was announced was actually false. It was not a real moratorium because it turns out interest payments will continue to accrue. That's ridiculous. A proper moratorium means nothing, means no interest accrues either over this period. So what the government should have done is a moratorium on all interest payments for the next 3 months, which the government subsidizes. In other words, you can't make the banks collapse because of that, but the government must subsidize. The government can actually print money to subsidize this along with all of the other expenditures that I have outlined. Because if you want to still have a banking system at the end of this, you have to recognize that a lot of the loans have become unviable. And that's also exceptionally true of non-banks. Mahek, what are the effects of COVID-19 on the migrant laborers? Well, Mahek, we've seen it, haven't we? We've seen what has been happening. What is remarkable is that we have, this economy relies hugely, we don't even realize how much, but I would say 90% of construction workers, a very large percentage of the low-grade services in all of our urban areas, all entirely fueled by migrants from rural areas. A lot of even agricultural labor is migrant labor coming from other states. Now, all of this, first of all, you have given them zero protection. You have actually just literally stopped their economic activity and therefore their livelihood. You have then given them no kind of protection wherever they are or to get home or even when they reach home. You have exposed them to disease because they're all crowding desperately into wherever they can to somehow make their way home because they have nothing to eat and nothing to earn where they are. And you are actually not just compounding the public health problem, but you are reminding them that they're utterly expendable. So that all your activities are catering to this urban middle class that can come on balconies and beach thalis or light patakas, for God's sake, in the middle of this. All your togetherness and oneness, and we are all united, is all about the middle classes staying in their clean little rooms by themselves. There is nothing about the conditions of most people in the country, at least 60% of the country, who cannot do physical distancing. I will not use the term social distancing, I think it stinks. Cannot do physical distancing because they live together in 5 people to a room, not just in urban areas, but in many semi-urban and villages, okay? They are chock-a-block where they live in these communities. They cannot afford to actually practice all of those things. They don't have access to clean water and soap to keep washing their hands every time they touch something. So we are putting down rules which are based on what's going on in Europe and the US, which do not take into account the lived realities of most of our people. So not only can they not protect themselves, but there is no government measure to give them any kind of minimal, what they need for survival and dignity. Contrast that to how we are treating migrants who are stuck in Italy or France or China. We're sending planes for them. We're rolling out all facilities. We're putting them in special quarantine zones. And yet we don't even provide trains or buses for our migrants inside the country who want to get back to their homes. And anyone who does try and provide it is suspended, and the cases are brought against them. Okay, what 5-10 measures would you suggest to improve the current situation? I think I've already mentioned them, but I'm going to just repeat them. Immediate income transfer to a wide range of people and of a significant amount, not pathetic amounts of 500 and so on. Immediate emphasis on supply of necessities and recognition of the input-output relationships of that supply, so that you're not just saying, okay, food. You have to think of the entire backward and forward linkages. What inputs do they need? How will they access them? How will they package the product? How will they sell the product? How will they distribute the product? All of that you have to think of at once immediately. Number 3, massive increase in the public health measures. Everybody knows what they are. You already have another webinar on them, so I'm not going to repeat that, but definitely you need a lot of that. Number 4, focus on agriculture, because at the moment, even now, you are not allowing farmers to sell their products. Mandis are still not open. Farmers can still not get their crops to the centers. There's a real problem in terms of ensuring that they get adequate supply. Adequate access to the markets. And what does that mean? It means that even in future, because people will not have incomes, their prices are not going to rise. So you really have to ramp up procurement operations, extend it to all the 32 crops that you officially give procurement to, but you don't actually, and make sure farmers get a decent price, because they're going to be faced with very low prices, even when there are shortages. The margins will be kept by distributors. So these are some of the urgent measures. To deal with the fact of the impact of the global economy, we have to put in capital controls. We have to dramatically underwrite all the bad loans of the banking sector, which will be resulting from this COVID disaster, not just the existing bad loans. Now, all of this means a lot of money. But as I said, across the world, governments are spending 5 to 15% of GDP. What I'm suggesting would come to about 7% of GDP. And frankly, that's not an issue. The government simply has to borrow from the RBI. It's called monetized deficit. It's been doing that in a slimy way all this period. Nobody is going to question you at this point globally about whether your fiscal deficit is too high, because every other government in the world recognizes that you cannot meet this disaster without huge public spending. So those are my measures. Okay, Soumya, are there tax revenues? Just a second, let me just see if I can, why is this not, here's. Soumya is asking, as the tax revenues are far below projections, do you think the government should forget fiscal responsibility, print more money, let inflation happen, and introduce an urban employment guarantee along with MNREGA? Yes, absolutely. But here's the thing, I don't think inflation will happen unless you don't deal with the supply concerns that I have highlighted. Right now, you're not going to get demand push inflation. Even if you throw money at this, even if you create, as I said, double the liquidity and just hand it all over to the government to spend, you will still not get demand pull inflation because demand has collapsed. What you will get is supply side inflation. You will get shortages and you will get cost push inflation because it will be harder to get imported inputs and the prices of those will rise. So you have to deal with those. You have to deal with the supply side, the cost push and the shortages. Then you won't get inflation. You can spend part of the money that you are printing on that kind of supply side measures, which you have to do in any case. Absolutely the time for an urban NREG as well. But I would say a few months from now. Right now you can't do it because anyway you can't bring people together. Anyway we don't know how long the containment measures will continue, but it is likely that some kind of physical distancing is going to be required for several months, which basically means you can't do the kind of things that you would have done in a crisis earlier. You will have to just hand over cash. Okay. Thomas Rajendra, what can be done for homeless and migrant laborer who are back in the villages? In fact, one of the things we haven't talked about so much because the plight of migrants has been highlighted a lot in the media, but we haven't talked about those who are actually staying where they are. The migrants who haven't left and the other informal workers and the people in the villages. And by the way, their condition is also terrible. Those of you who looked at the impact of demonetization will remember how both rural and urban areas were absolutely devastated. Now, this is much worse, okay? So it's not just the migrants who are back in their villages, but it's everybody in the villages, and it's everybody in urban areas, including those who wanted to go back and the other informal workers who have lost their livelihood. Now, remember, we're talking about 90% of the workforce. It's not, I mean, we are talking about hundreds of millions of people. So that really means that we have to think of very, very large. That's why I'm emphasizing it has to be a big fiscal stimulus, and it has to contain these measures, which are part welfare measures, part demand revival measures, part supply side measures, okay? How do you think international financial institutions should react to the slowdowns in various countries? There are three things I believe that the international financial system must immediately do. And if they don't, this is a disaster for, by the way, global capitalism. And this is why even extraordinary places like the Financial Times, which is, you know, the voice of the City of London, even they have come out saying fiscal deficit is no longer an issue. We need a change in the global financial architecture. Even they are saying this because they realize this is actually such an unprecedented crisis that it could mean the end of capitalism as we know it as well. So what are the three immediate things that we have to do? The IMF has a foreign exchange reserve asset called the SDR, special drawing rights, which most people don't know about because they never use it. But basically, what does it mean? The IMF is in a position to create liquidity. Okay, the IMF can actually, it's like a central bank creating money. The IMF can create liquidity. It can issue more SDRs. Even the UN, UNCTAD, has called for at least a $1 trillion increase in SDR issues. And even the IMF head, Kristalina Georgieva, even she has said that the financing requirements of the developing world is at least 1.5 trillion and possibly more. So number one, a huge increase in the issue of special drawing rights. Now, what are these? These get allocated to all the member countries according to their share in the IMF quota. Okay, now every country has a share, which is some kind of a ratio of their share in world trade and various other things. Obviously, the rich countries have the biggest share. But in a period like this, when developing countries are massively short of foreign exchange, for developing countries, this can be a lifeline. The US has a very big share, but it doesn't need the IMF quota because its dollar can be used everywhere. The Eurozone similarly, you know, these hold already what are global reserve currencies. But if India gets an allocation of so much SDR, that means it can use that SDR to pay for some imports, to do some debt servicing. It can free up money for other uses. Yeah, countries that are in massive problem at the moment, Zambia, South Africa, Colombia, Brazil, I mean, you know, an issue of SDRs to the tune of 1 trillion would make a big difference in terms of alleviating the immediate distress. So that's number one, big issue of SDRs. Number two, debt. You have to do something about restructuring debt. Just like I was saying, you have to do something to capitalize the banks and get rid of some of their bad debt and so on. You have to do something globally to restructure debt, to provide debt relief, because first of all, a moratorium on all payments without adding interest for 3 months. And secondly, then cut down on some of the debt, provide haircuts. It will have to happen, okay? And the sooner it's done, the better. The longer you delay the problem, the worse it gets for all the debtor countries. So that's the second big thing that has to be done. And the third thing I've already mentioned, you have to allow capital controls. Right now, financial markets are dramatically adding to our problems. They're causing big capital flight and therefore currency depreciation, okay? The rupee has gone from 70 to 75 in a matter of a week per dollar. So you have to stem that flow. You have to stop capital movements. So you have to enable. It's much better done globally. I mean, every country can try and do it, but it's much better done if the IMF declares that it's a good idea right now to institute capital controls for this period, for this amazing global emergency that we're going through. Okay, John D'Souza, pay NREGA wages in advance against future work? Absolutely. I'm just saying put money in the accounts of all NREGA workers. You promise 100 days of work, you never actually give it. Give at least 3 months of work wages immediately. Okay, it doesn't even have to be an advance against future work. I would say just give it. as a cash transfer immediately. Increase agriculture health wages by more than 50% to privilege the essential economy. Yes, but how do you do that? You'd have to do that with strong public intervention. First of all, frontline health workers, the Anganwadi workers, the Ashas, all of the people who are actually out there as your basic force of protection. Pay them minimum wages, make them proper public employees, make sure they have adequate protection, give them other kinds of social security, okay? And give them the kind of training that will be required to deal with a large-scale public health emergency. In terms of other wages, the only way you can ensure that market wages rise is with a significant increase in public employment at decent wage rates. Most public employment has actually been at less than minimum wage. The increases in public employment have all been at less than the minimum wage because they're all scheme workers who are dominantly women. That has to end. We have to actually regularize them, pay them properly, and give them the basic facilities that they need to do their work. Malati, how do we think the impact on rural livelihoods will pan out in the next few months? Oh, so bad. I think I've already outlined it. The negative multiplier effects that we've been talking about, they're just as bad in rural areas as they are in urban areas. If we don't take strong action now, we are in for a prolonged depression, not recession, depression. That's very, very bad, okay? John D'Souza, social distancing is more viable in the agricultural sector. Why not open this segment and leave it to the panchayats and collectors to decide? Yeah, physical distancing can be done in a lot of activities, and you have to decentralize this. You have to decentralize. You cannot give a diktat from above and say everybody has to do the following, because it depends crucially, as I said, how do you do physical distancing in Seelampur, a slum that I visited recently during the anti-CAA protests, when everybody is living cheek by jowl in these tiny houses, these tenements that go up for 7 floors, and there are 5 to 10 people in every little room, and there are 4 rooms on every floor, and it's a tiny thing like this, and all the buildings are next to each other. What does it even mean to talk about physical distancing in that? So you have to decentralize, allow local level to figure out how to do these things. In certain villages, it may be very feasible. In other villages, it may be very difficult because even there are slums and concentrations of settlements, especially by caste. So yes, definitely decentralize this. Not in a very draconian way. The Bhilwara model that is being talked about, that's a very draconian and destructive kind of imposition. I would say when you isolate the people who are most at risk and those who have a chance of getting the disease, you do very strong measures of distancing for them, but allow others to figure out a viable way of functioning, because otherwise you can't just simply say India close down and go home and everybody die. You have to actually keep this country going, which means keeping the economy going. Okay, please translate into English. I did. Anil, what is your assessment about the government's response to the small scale and traditional fish workers in the country? Although there are 1.6 crore, yeah. I mean, my assessment is that it's a disaster, like it's a disaster for everybody else. There's absolutely no consideration of the specific problems faced by fish workers, just as there is no consideration even of the sanitation workers, who are the front line against this kind of thing, and protecting them, paying them properly, ensuring that they stay free from disease. There's no consideration, frankly, to any particular group of workers. The only consideration so far has been for the middle class and for big business. Maju Varghese, we note with concern the statement by Malpass that states will have to undergo structural assessment for accessing the World Bank COVID funds. What is in the offering? What kind of structural adjustment? Yeah, it cannot be good news, okay? It will be more liberalization, more imperialism at work. I am not in favor of giving more power to the World Bank and the IMF at this point because their track record is not good. When I'm talking about an increase in the SDRs, that is not something over which the IMF has power over. It will have to be distributed according to quota. Every country will automatically be able to access it. That's very different from capitalizing the IMF and giving them power to decide who gets what. Just like giving the World Bank power, giving them a big bunch of money and saying you decide who gets it. I think that's a disaster. And I'm not in favor of that. I'm much more in favor of global measures to tax international corporations the same as other corporations are taxed. That will already release about 4 or 5% of global GDP to be distributed in countries according to the multinationals' operations in those countries. I'm much more in favor of a transactions tax, a cross-border transactions tax of 0.05%, very small, but it will still release a lot of money, and so on. How does the government cover up huge losses incurred currently? By which you mean the fact that it will be spending more than it gets in tax revenues. No problem, you finance it with central bank money. That is, you borrow from the central bank, which is basically called deficit financing or monetized deficit. And it will only be inflationary if you don't address supply bottlenecks. So let's emphasize this point. You can create money out of nothing, because money is not this fixed thing, right? You can create money out of nothing. It would be inflationary if you have supply bottlenecks. Right now, we have massive unemployment. We have a lot of unutilized capacity. We will get supply bottlenecks in some sectors because of the nature of this disease and the kind of physical distancing measures. But if we address those, then this need not be inflationary. Deepu, MSMEs and small businesses have been massively affected. Mostly cash and revenues have vanished, but not the costs. There's been almost no impetus on how these businesses will be financially helped by the government. I agree with you completely. And I would say that the measures we've talked about have to be accompanied by a package for MSMEs once the dust settles, okay? ESI PF contribution is inadequate, absolutely. Seems to be for companies with 90% of employees earning below 15,000. Both criteria difficult to fulfill for small enterprises. Urban Bengaluru has a minimum wage of 15,000. And to have 90% earning less than that is another difficult point. No good loan schemes, no proper statutory payment exemptions. I completely agree with you. I think the package so far is pathetic. It's not just too small in the aggregate, but it's not even recognizing the problems that are being faced right now. So I think it's so far what we've got is almost nothing from the government. So we must be demanding these things. We must be demanding a moratorium on interest payments, which does not add interest to the future. In other words, there's a moratorium on loan payments in which current interest rates are not added. If the banks and non-banks complain, the government has to subsidize it, okay? Also, I would argue, yes, support for salary payments. They've done this in the UK and elsewhere, that if you keep your workers, we will subsidize you. We will pay 50% of their salaries, say, if you keep your workers. If you don't, then we will not, okay? Right. Does cash transfer, this is from Malati, does cash transfer be effective in the light of food supplies? I go back to that point. You have to focus on the supply. You have to do measures to ensure the supply, okay? How will this gender dimension of this crisis? Yeah, it's very big. First of all, look, our frontline health workers are dominantly women in the worst possible conditions and with below minimum wages. We have to make sure that they get decent conditions and that they are safe themselves from this. That's a major gender dimension. There's a gender dimension of the lockdown. We know that most physical abuse of women happens within homes, and now women are trapped in their homes. It's shocking to realize that the number of phone calls made to helpline has come down because women have nowhere to go. And you know, so I'm genuinely concerned about the gender dimension of the lockdown itself, not just of the overall. But we also know that wherever jobs get scarce, women get disproportionately moved out of jobs. And that is happening already, and that will continue to happen. It will actually get worse. Okay, I'm afraid I've left, okay. Oh, there are many, many questions. Okay, I have to be much faster in my responses.
We could extend by 10 minutes or so.
Okay, okay. So let me see now. Oh my goodness.
Kasturi Adhikari.
I've done. Do you remember what time was that? Cash transfer be effective? I talked about that.
23.
Adhikari, there's been a constant fund cut. How will this oppression affect UGC? I'm deeply worried. I am deeply worried. By the way, even before all this happened, per capita spending on students in real terms from the UGC had come down by half. Half, okay? This is before all of this happened. I dread to think what will happen now. I mean, yeah, I don't want to depress you further, so it will be bad. And that means fewer scholarships, that means less access, it means higher fees, all the things they were trying to do already, they will now enforce big time. Karthik, do you think the pandemic will shine light on societal and economic systems? Yes, it will. Definitely, it already has, right? I mean, the fact of privatizing what should be public health and what implications that has. When somebody like Boris Johnson has to go into ICU, that maybe will make them think that we were wrong to constantly privatize and reduce public spending on health and so on. Maybe it will. Let's hope it will. We know that the global financial crisis did not do that, that the power of the finance lobby remained as big as ever, and they were able to influence government policies. Let's see. I mean, I hope it forces a rethink. It should force a rethink, but we have to be active in forcing that rethink. It's not going to happen on its own. Yeah. What is your take on devolution? Oh God, the devolution part is disgusting. They haven't even paid their dues. The central government owes 40,000 crore to the states from last year. They still haven't paid what they owe legally. Not even the GST compensation. I'm not even talking about the compensation. I'm talking about the basic GST that the central government collected. It hasn't paid that to the states. Okay. So the fiscal devolution has been appalling. This has been a terribly centralizing government. Why is it bad? Because not only is it centralizing, but then it's incompetent. So at least if it was centralizing and then being competent nationally, you could say, okay, fine. But since they're so incompetent, and state governments have been, some of them have been better at handling this, at least decentralize more, devolve more. The state governments are the ones taking all the load of the crisis. You're doing nothing. And yet you're holding on to all the resources that they need. Why does it matter? Because state governments have a hard budget constraint. Literally, their checks will bounce from day to day if they don't have the money in hand. So it's absolutely criminal that the central government is not doing its minimum statutorily required devolution when it should be doubling the amount of devolved resources. Basant, knowing the kind of government we have and the way it works, what steps can we expect? Oh God, oh, what a terrible question, Basant, because I can only say so far it has been completely inadequate. And in fact, I would say even wrong, even criminal. I have mentioned that it's a cruel, sadistic kind of approach to the lockdown. I don't know what more we can expect from this government. I wish I could tell you that we can expect great things. I know what should be done. I know what can be done. I know many state governments also have very good ideas on what can and should be done and would be willing to implement it. Can we expect the central government to respond? I wish we could. Mehak, how much time will it recover after this pandemic? It will take a very long time. It will take a very long time. It will take years. But it needs, even that recovery will need very quick action and very large action, as I pointed out. It can't happen with tiny little measures, incremental measures. It needs big public spending, and it needs to happen quickly, and it needs to happen in a sustained way in the places that matter. Otherwise, we're headed for a very, very prolonged bad time. Can Ayushman Bharat scheme help to counter the pandemic? No, not at all, because it's entirely private insurance based. There's nothing in that that can do anything for the pandemic, because the pandemic is all about public health concerns. It has to be government spending directly on the health system. So Ayushman Bharat is completely irrelevant in this. Do I think the Indian capitalist class is in complete agreement with the Indian state's lockdown and other measures? No, I don't. I think the capitalist class is worried, you know. And I think if we get a partial lifting, it will be because capitalists have put pressure on the government, because they are also bleeding. Yeah, I mean, this is, as I said, it's a generalized collapse. So they are also bleeding. If government had planned strategy first and announced lockdown, wouldn't it be too late because the number of new cases were getting decelerated post-lockdown? No, the government knew at least a week before that it needed to do a lockdown. There are those who say that ministries were already being told, but it was all delayed because they wanted to make sure they got the government of Madhya Pradesh. So the lockdown, the government knew that they had to do a lockdown. They could have told the people 1 week before. They could have said, we are planning a lockdown from the following date. in the interim, we will allow, and we know that this is going to affect migrant workers badly. Therefore, we are going to put in place special trains. We're stopping all non-essential travel, but we will put in place special trains, special buses for those who want to get back home. Just like they did for Gujarati migrants. Middle-class Gujarati migrants were also allowed to leave in special buses. They could have done that. They could have given people time. They could have allowed preparation. You had 4 months since when you knew that COVID was going to be a problem. You give the population of the country 4 hours to prepare for what is likely to be a lockdown of a month or more. It's not done. It's unacceptable. And it's not that it would have been too late. They could have announced it earlier and still implemented it on the same date. Neeta Hardikar, as campaigns, we're demanding 200 wage days under MNREGA. Yes, absolutely. But I would say let's begin by transferring money into the accounts of MNREGA workers. Let's transfer 3 months of wages into MNREGA workers already. Yeah, begin. Yes, after that we can consider 200 wage days. Right now, put money into their bank accounts. You're not able to give them work. You are supposed to give an unemployment insurance of half the wages if you do not give them work. Give that to all your MNREGA workers because you are not running works at the moment. Does the government have any idea? Does the government have any idea? I don't think so. What it should be doing is actually ensuring supply, as I've told you. So to reduce inflation, it's cost plus inflation, it's shortage inflation, address the shortages, address the costs. What policy action would you recommend for the government to take for agriculture, healthcare, and the banking sector? I think I've already discussed these. So since there are many other questions, Rashali, I'm going to go on to the next. The role of regulatory institutions like RBI to lessen the impact of this crisis on banks. And look, number one, you have to accept that a lot of repayment is going to become very difficult. So I suspect that immediately there should be a real moratorium, not a moratorium that includes interest payments, but a moratorium that says no interest payments in this period. The banks who will need to actually keep showing that they're getting interest, do something to underwrite those costs, okay? And finally, you will have to recapitalize. There's no question about it, because even 3 months later, this is going to be an economy in such a deep mess that most repayments are not going to happen. There will be large-scale defaults. So you will have to be recapitalizing the banks and non-banks as well. And they should recognize this now and start planning for how to do it. Prabhat, thank you for your success. Thank you, Prabhat. Because this government is so partisan, eminent economists who have good ideas for solving these problems don't seem to have the governments here. What's the way out of this helplessness? I wish I knew. No answer for that one. Ratnavel, has the government incorporated sought expert opinion of academics in its fiscal response to the pandemic? Not to my knowledge. Mehak, but if we provide the trains to them, then the purpose of the lockdown will just wash away. No, the idea would be that you provide trains ensuring physical distancing. Sure, it's more expensive. Every other country in the world has done it. We did it for people who were in Germany and Italy and France and Japan and China. We did it for Gujarati migrants in Delhi. So you can do it. You need the political will, and yes, it costs more. But why do we say that the migrants who have kept our economy running, why do they not deserve the least bit of attention from us? Given the financial crisis, this is Rajesh, in the power sector, do you think this financial crisis in power is going to get worse? Yeah, sure. Of course, listen, financial crisis for every sector is worse. No sector is viable today because nothing is running, right? And that is why public sector banks will be affected, and that is why there will be more bad loans, and that is why they will have to be recapitalized. Absolutely. Vaishali, given that we're living in crisis, do you think government will consider universal basic income? So look, as I said, I'm not normally a fan of UBI, but right now you have to give cash transfers because people have no means of earning. So you will have to give it. Are they going to do it? Well, look what they did so far, 500 rupees to women Jan Dhan account holders. I mean, really? That's obscene. So far they have done nothing. I hope they consider it. Even the money for the farmers, they said we will pay the PM Kisan in April. But that they had to pay anyway. It was due in April. How can you put that as a package? At least say, okay, we're increasing PM Kisan to 8,000 rupees, then I understand. But no, you're simply paying what you were going to pay anyway, and you're putting that as part of your relief package. I mean, that's disgusting, right? Will it affect the collection of GST? Yes. I mean, look, how can you pay GST when you're not transacting? Yeah, economic activity has stopped. Hardly anything is being purchased. Hardly any services or goods are being supplied and traded and transacted. Where's the question of paying GST on all of that? Of course it will collapse. Will the disruption in labor force now and for the coming weeks or months? There are reports which say harvesting and sowing seasons will be affected. Yes, remember a lot of them across the country relied on migrant labor. And all of that is now hugely affected. Even accessing local labor is much more difficult, definitely, which is why I'm saying you have to think about the production and distribution of all of these essential goods. Currently, there's no evidence that they're thinking about it in this way. You have to actually make sure there are not labor shortages for harvesting, which are very likely already farmers are complaining about it. Has the capacity of the government to respond to such economic disasters inherently reduced because of neoliberal policies and the withdrawal of the welfare state? Yes, absolutely. Part of our public health crisis is also because we never expanded public health to any reasonable level. Even health spending per capita has come down in this government. Actually, it's been coming down since 2012. Per capita health spending has been declining. Government health spending has been declining for the last 8 years. And so we have run down everything and we are left with a bare skeletal framework, which we have to now expand massively if we're going to come back to anything like a minimum society that survives with minimum civilization, okay? Aman's father, okay. Basant, in view of the enormity of the likely livelihood, how big a social unrest? Now there, you guys know better than me. So I would have thought that even the kinds of crises we had after demonetization would generate social unrest. They didn't. Instead, what we got was social ugliness. We got the ability of political leaders to turn one section of society against another, not on class lines, but on religious lines, on caste lines. I don't know anymore. I don't know how society responds. There seems to have been a sort of lobotomization of our people, where we think that whatever the government is doing is all right because they're telling us to come out and bang pots and pans. And then we can go out and show completely no solidarity with the same workers whom we were supposedly celebrating, the health workers. So I don't know. I do know that there will be more social unrest because the economic conditions are going to get very, very much worse. How that plays out and whether it reveals more ugliness or more demands that the government will be forced to meet, that depends on whether we are still able to get these messages across to ordinary people or whether they will continue to be taken in by a massive media exercise that this government is able to somehow project. Is this kind of scenario likely to revitalize the much needed role of the state? It should, and reduce the ever increasing passion for capitalism. As I said, it certainly should. And you know, it's these messages, we don't know how it will play out, but I'm sure in England, the fact that they ran down the public health service, the National Health Service was a shadow itself of what it was. That's going to change because now the elite, right? Prince Charles, Boris Johnson, everybody's getting this disease. And you're realizing that there's a real shortage of ventilators and of dialysis machines and of all kinds of other things, okay? So yes, in some countries it will definitely change. I believe even in India it should change. But as I said, you know, I no longer understand a lot of how public opinion is shaped in India. The gender dimension we have already talked about. A major difficulty for migrants is the ability to pay a house rent. Absolutely, yes. A major proportion of any income support or cash transfer is likely to land in the hands of landlords. Do you think it's a good idea to collectively stop paying rent along with the other demands that you listed? If there was a lot of power of those who are paying rent, but remember that we are a very, very divided society. And there is caste, there is class, there is patriarchy, there is ethnic divisions. So many of the people who are renting in urban areas, they are discriminated in all sorts of ways. They may be discriminated because they're from the Northeast. They may be discriminated because they're from Kashmir, or because they're Muslim, or because they're from a lower caste. All kinds of other things are involved here. So it's not just enough to make a generalized thing, don't pay rent. Many people who are tenants do not have that privilege. And in fact, they are likely to be thrown out for other reasons as well. We have to recognize that. And in fact, local governments have to recognize that. The Delhi government has to recognize that. The government in other parts of the country has to recognize that and take special measures to protect tenants. So I think it's not easy for us to just generally say, oh, don't pay rent, because that reflects our class privilege and our caste privilege and our other privileges. We have to recognize that we are a very, very unequal, divided, and discriminatory society, and take measures that, protect the weak in these unequal relationships.
Okay, we have 5 more minutes.
Oh my God. Okay, I'm going to just read out all the questions and then answer some of them. Shomyajit, can we call it a Keynesian tailspin? Yes, it is. Should the state be given more autonomy? At the state governments, yes, and they need more money, not just autonomy, they need more resources of the common pool of resources, because they're the ones doing all the hard work. They are the ones handling this big mess. So definitely they need their own. They need autonomy, they need debt restructuring of their own debt. They should be allowed to take on more debt. They need more of the centralized, the total resources of the government as well. If the past 6 years are any indication, most of the steps you've out won't happen or will be implemented badly. What's the worst case scenario? You don't really want to be so depressed. All I can tell you is that the worst case scenario is something so bad that I don't want to talk about it here. Very, very bad is the worst case scenario. 30% cut taken by MPs will be used as a template. Yes, absolutely. Not just private sector, even government sector. I think this is just a kind of beginning message to cut all salaries, which is a very stupid thing to do in the middle of economic collapse. What you should be doing is maintaining and increasing the salaries of the bottom while ensuring supply, as I have outlined already. Some are privileged to work at home. Won't that have any impact on the Indian economy? No, because our ability to work at home rests on all of those hundreds of millions of workers who do not work from home. We have this luxury of this conversation because everything is supplied to us, and all of that will cease if, as I said, all those crores of workers do stop working. What about the Prime Minister Garib Kalyan Yojana? As I said, it's 0.5% of GDP in real new money. It's pathetically small, it's unequal, and it will have zero impact. Sampath Kali, what would be the long-term impacts on drought-affected states like Maharashtra? Oh God, well, as I said, agriculture in general is in distress. And in addition, you have drought, and the state governments don't have money. They will not be able to do the drought relief program. So yeah, it's a problem. Is the central governance unable to maintain the idea of federalism? It is anti-federal. Everything it's been doing is anti-federal. Those who expected that Narendra Modi, having been a chief minister of a state, would be more federalist in his outlook, have given up on that belief a very long time ago. This is the most centralizing government we have had since the colonial period. And it is it's not just centralizing, it's also partisan. So if it has a state government with a party it doesn't like Kerala, it gives a pathetic 146 crore as relief. 146 crore, that's how much one of their BJP MPs spends on their daughter's wedding. Okay, so really, it's a very unfederal government. Anika, if government had told you earlier about the lockdown, don't you think people will be on the roads and purchasing items in stock, black market and whatever, and due to so many people out there, more? No, because you can enforce physical distancing norms before a complete lockdown. You can tell all stores that you maintain, 2 meters distance, whatever. You can put all these rules into place without a complete lockdown, which is what happened. More people will be on the road. You limit, you say only essential. So you can do it in a staggered way. Okay. Yeah. I think that's it. Oh my God, there are more questions, but yeah, we've come to the end of the time. Thank you all very much. I'm sorry I couldn't answer all the questions.
Thank you so much for that great clarity, and it was an eye-opening session to all of us. And to our audience here, kindly join us again at 3 p.m. today for another webinar on labor reforms, informal workers, and impacts of lockdown by Chandan Kumar, who's a labor rights activist. It's at 3 p.m. So we look forward to all of you joining us again. Thank you, Professor Ghosh, again for that wonderful session. Thank you, everyone.